Question 45. What is the harm principle as given by J.S. Mill? Name any provision of the Indian Constitution reflecting this view of J.S. Mill. Topics to be covered. 1. Introduction, context and thinker. 2. Meaning and explanation of the harm principle. 3. Philosophical basis of the principle. 4. Application of the harm principle in liberal democracy. 5. Illustrative examples of the harm principle. 6. Limitations and criticisms. 7. Reflection of Mill's harm principle in the Indian Constitution. 8. Summary for quick understanding. 9. Quick revision notes. 10. One-line questions and answers for revision. 11. Final connection. 1. Introduction, context and thinker. The harm principle is one of the most important contributions of John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, the 19th century English philosopher and political thinker, presented in his famous work on liberty 1859. Mill, a champion of individual liberty, sought to define the legitimate limits of state and social interference in the life of individuals. His harm principle became a cornerstone of liberal political philosophy, defending freedom of thought, speech, and action within moral and social boundaries. 2. Meaning and explanation of the harm principle. The harm principle states that the only justification for society or the state to limit an individual's liberty is to prevent harm to others. Mill's famous formulation reads, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." In essence, individuals should be free to act as they wish as long as their actions do not harm others. The state or society cannot interfere merely to protect individuals from themselves. Such interference is paternalistic and contrary to liberty. Thus, liberty is absolute in self-regarding actions, those affecting only the individual, and limited in other regarding actions, those affecting others. 3. Philosophical basis of the principle. Mill's harm principle is rooted in utilitarianism, the idea that actions are right if they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He believed that individual liberty is essential for personal and social progress. By allowing free expression and experimentation in lifestyle, society benefits from diversity, innovation, and truth. However, liberty is not unlimited. It must stop where it causes injury to others, as unrestricted freedom would threaten the very conditions of liberty itself. 4. Application of the harm principle in liberal democracy. The harm principle plays a vital role in balancing individual freedom and social control. I. Freedom of speech. Individuals have the right to express opinions, even unpopular ones, unless such speech incites violence, hatred, or injury to others. 2. Freedom of action. A person may live as he chooses, dress, worship, or think freely unless such behavior violates others' rights or disrupts public order. 3. Limiting state power. The state must not impose laws for the moral or paternal good of individuals. Coercion is justified only to prevent harm to others' life, liberty, or property. Example: if an adult wishes to consume harmful substances, society cannot stop him solely for his own good, but if his action endangers others, example, drunk driving, it can be restricted. 5 illustrative examples of the harm principle. Example 1. A person has freedom of speech but not to spread hate speech that may cause communal violence. Example 2. An individual may choose his lifestyle, religion, or attire freely as long as it does not harm others' rights or public safety. Example 3. Freedom of movement may be restricted during a pandemic to prevent harm to others through infection, a direct application of Mill's principle in public health contexts. In each case, liberty is protected, but the line is drawn where harm to others begins. 6 limitations and criticisms of the harm principle. Difficulty in defining harm. Critics argue that harm is a vague concept. It may be physical, emotional, or moral, making the principle difficult to apply consistently. 2. Cultural relativity. What counts as harm varies across societies, hence, applying a universal rule can be problematic. 3. Neglect of moral and social values. Conservatives argue that Mill's principle undermines collective morality by ignoring the importance of shared social norms. 4. Overemphasis on individualism. Communitarian critics claim Mill's focus on personal liberty neglects the interdependence and social responsibilities of individuals. Despite these criticisms, the harm principle remains a foundational idea in liberal constitutions and civil rights frameworks. 7. Reflection of Mill's harm principle in the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution embodies Mill's harm principle in its balance between fundamental rights and reasonable restrictions. Article 19(1) guarantees individual freedoms such as freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of profession. However, Article 19(2)(6) imposes reasonable restrictions on these freedoms in the interest of public order, morality, decency, or the rights of others. This precisely reflects Mill's view. Freedom is essential but not absolute. It must be limited only to prevent harm to others or to society. Examples. The state can restrict hate speech to prevent communal harm. Freedom of assembly cannot justify violent protests, harm to public order. Freedom of profession cannot include illegal trades, harm to morality or safety. Therefore, Article 19 embodies Mill's harm principle by safeguarding liberty while allowing regulation to prevent injury to others or to society's peace and welfare. 8. Summary for quick understanding. The harm principle of J.S. Mill asserts that liberty should only be restricted to prevent harm to others, not for an individual's own good. It establishes a moral boundary for both state and social interference, balancing individual autonomy with collective welfare. This principle is reflected in Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, which grants freedoms with reasonable restrictions to ensure that one's liberty does not violate the rights or safety of others. 9. Quick revision notes. Thinker John Stuart Mill, on Liberty, 1859. Principle: restrict liberty only to prevent harm to others. Philosophy: liberalism and utilitarianism. Core idea: freedom is absolute in self-regarding acts, limited in other regarding acts. Criticism: vague concept of harm, neglect of morality. Indian reflection: Article 19, fundamental freedoms with reasonable restrictions. Purpose: balance between liberty and public order. 10 one-line questions and answers for revision. 1. Who proposed the harm principle? John Stuart Mill. 2. In which work was it explained? On Liberty, 1859. 3. What does the harm principle state? Liberty may be limited only to prevent harm to others. 4. What kind of actions are absolutely free under Mill's view? Self-regarding actions. 5. What kind of actions can be restricted? Other regarding actions that harm others. 6. Which article of the Indian Constitution reflects this principle? Article 19. 7. What do Articles 19 to 6 provide? Reasonable restrictions on fundamental freedoms. 8. What is the philosophical basis of Mill's view? Utilitarianism and liberalism. 9. What is the purpose of restricting liberty under the harm principle? To protect others' rights and public safety. 10. Why is the harm principle important in democracy? It ensures freedom with responsibility and social balance. 11. Final connection. J.S. Mill's harm principle remains a timeless guide for modern democracies. It upholds freedom as a moral necessity while recognizing responsibility as its ethical limit. In India, this philosophy finds constitutional expression in Article 19, which protects individual liberty yet permits reasonable restrictions to prevent harm to others and to society. Thus, Mill's principle and the Indian Constitution together affirm that true liberty does not mean the absence of restraint, but the presence of justice, responsibility, and respect for others' freedom.